Welcome to Creative Communities. My name is Daniel and I'm here to quickly introduce the video you're about to see. The video you're about to see is the recording from day 1 of series 1 of Creative Communities. A huge thank you to Thomas Evans for kicking off our series with an amazing talk, Rick and Morty and the Vagueries of Satire. Thomas is a student from Keele University. Again, thank you so much to him for the amazing talk and for agreeing to do it. Thank you also to the AHRC's NWCDTP for helping to support this series of events. Without further ado, enjoy.
What is Rick and Morty? It's just in case you're interested in watching a presentation on the topic, but you've never actually watched it. So Rick and Morty follows a character called Rick and a character called Morty. You can see them in the image to the left there. Rick is an elderly, alcoholic, nihilistic, suicidal scientist who's managed to invent the ability to move through the multiverse, to travel through the multiverse via portals and stuff. And he goes on a series of errands and he drags his grandson, Morty, along with him. And you think, as it seems like it's going to be, sort of like, sort of the standard high concept sci-fi rigmarole. And it largely is. But it has this nihilistic sort of angry bent to it. As I say, Rick is not a particularly nice person. The multiverse is not a particularly nice place. We'll get into that sort of as we carry on talking sort of about the show. And as well as focusing on Rick and Morty, it focuses on their extended family as well. And you can see them in the image to the right. For time purposes, I'm not going to go through who they are, but they exist and they're part of the show as well. So Rick and Morty is an interesting show to talk about, particularly nowadays, because I remember when Rick and Morty was canonically the best thing on TV, and then series 3 happened. And that's sort of not quite the case anymore. And you get a lot of people sort of critiquing Rick and Morty. And the reason why I think sort of there's now this split opinion about the show is that there's one fundamental question about the program which is surprisingly difficult to answer. And that is basically Rick and Morty, is it anti-Rick or is it pro-Rick? Because as I say, Rick is a quite reprehensible character in his own right. He is vicious to the people around him. We watch him murder just hundreds of people. So if over the course of the show, like on screen, he's constantly belittling of people. He is, sort of this, sort of egotist extraordinaire. Is, sort of, and in about halfway through this talk, I'm going to argue that the show, sort of uses him to represent like just the worst aspects of modern society of the moment. But on the other hand, the show, I mean, he's one of the named characters. He's one of the main characters. And there's a lot of episodes which are dedicated to exploring him as a character and to creating sympathy for him, to try to understand him. And he's quite usually sort of, I mean, a lot of his sort of like petty abuses that he does, sort of he justifies them based on the idea that he knows the most about the universe and thus, sort of he's better than everyone else. And the thing about it is that the show treats him as usually pretty correct about the universe. The show sort of does almost sort of justify him in that way. And so in Rick and Morty, there is this odd pull, is that sort of it's visibly fascinated and interested in the character that it presents as like being one of the worst people in existence. And it makes it surprisingly difficult in many ways to read the show and know how to read it. This particularly ties into sort of some ideas about satire in general, because satire relies so much upon irony and related sort of things like this. Because it relies so much upon recognizing certain modes of watching and reading them in certain ways. It can be quite difficult to sort of actually figure out how the average audience member is going to relate to a text. Is because audiences are, sort of single gestalt entities. Sort of they're very multifaceted, particularly nowadays in the days of fragmentation of audiences, thanks to digital technologies. Thanks to things like Netflix and, stuff like that. So there is a genuine issue with satire, which is that it is incredibly difficult to actually figure out what we can and can't say that satire does. is because it relies upon so many assumptions in audiences that have been broken down sort of in recent times, and that are sort of very difficult to sort of navigate and find, sort of proof for. And so that's basically what we're going to explore today, is sort of over the course of this talk, sort of let's take Rick and Morty seriously as a satirical text. Let's look at sort of the ways that the satire might be working, and let's look at what we can and can't say about how this type of satire works. And then at the end of it, let's wrap it up with a couple of conclusions about how, sort of maybe we should be contextualizing satire sort of nowadays, particularly if we're being interested in like producing it, for example, or, sort of just generally being able to write and read it. Before we get into that, I suppose, and start talking about Rick and Morty as a satirical text, I suppose we should actually discuss, sort of what is satire, sort of, and getting through the nitty gritty sort of formal section before we can start like having fun looking at YouTube videos. I've got a couple of historical definitions of satire up here for us. According to M.D. Fletcher, a satire is a verbal aggression in which some aspect of historical reality is exposed to ridicule. According to G.K. Chesterton, the essence of satire is that it perceives some absurdity inherent in the logic of some position, which is then drawn out so that all can see it. And Bronowski and Maslish, my apologies if I've mispronounced those, is that they say that satire is challenging accepted notions by making them ridiculous. Now, we're quite lucky, because basically these three sentences are saying the exact same thing, but just with slight syntax changes. Essentially sort of the way that satire works is that there will be a cultural assumption. There will be this sort of standard idea that exists in society. And the author of that satire, the satirical author, is going to have perceived some issue with this idea. And so what they're going to do is they've decided they're going to produce a text which will replicate that idea, but manipulate it so as to highlight what they consider to be the logical inconsistency. So let's say that, so if I was to give an example, let's say shoes. Let's say I'm going to make a satire about shoes. And we've got a whole bunch of cultural ideas about what shoes are. And largely, people think shoes are good because they protect our feet and they're really stylish and they're really good. Shoes are great. But I've got issue with shoes. I don't like shoes. And the reason why I don't like shoes is because they're made, sort of in sweatshops, sort of, and they're, sort of in horrendous labor conditions. And they're, as far as I'm concerned, they're representative of like sort of just sort of a horrific sort of violent abuses of the capitalist system that we are all prescribed to and live in. And so I decide that I'm going to make a satirical work which highlights that. And so let's say, so because we're talking about shoes, I take the form off a shoe, but I want to change the shoe, the form of the shoe, so that it reflects what I see being part of this idea, which is the violence and the sort of, nastiness of the culture that, goes into producing shoes. So let's say that I decide I'm going to make a shoe out of meat. And the idea is that sort of, people are going to look at it and they're going to recognize the shoe, but it's going to be a horrible shoe. And they're going to go, ooh, that's nasty. And the hope is that they're going to recontextualize sort of the way that they think about shoes, even if only for those few seconds. They will look at the shoe and they'll reconsider sort of what they think the form of the shoe is. And that would be a satirical text. It would be a terrible satirical text, which is incredibly on the nose, but it would count. So that's what satire does. It takes ideas that are prevalent in society that the author has issues with, and it reconfigures these ideas in ways that highlight the issues that they have with them. Because it's based around taking pre-existing recognizable forms and manipulating them, satire is commonly linked to parody, particularly if you take the Linda Hutcheon definition of parody, which is imitation with critical difference. So parody takes a pre-existing text and a genre and changes it so as to make fun of it. And as I say, sort of satire does basically the same thing, but to social concepts, let's say. is so sort of they're heavily interlinked, and you usually do get them sort of happening sort of at the same time. Is although they're not like fundamentally linked, you can have satirical works which aren't parodic in nature. You can have parodies which aren't satirical in nature, but quite frequently they do interlink, and we will look at examples of how these interlink in Rick and Morty, sort of in a couple of slides' time. Always negative, and I've put a question mark there, because these forms are about taking pre-existing things that people usually take at face value and usually take for granted. And basically what they do is they change them in order to say, actually, no, these things don't make sense. Actually, I've got an issue with these. There is the common conception that satire is an inherently negative art form, that it's basically what you use in order to take forms that you don't like and basically try to dismiss them and complain about them. I'm raising this at the moment because in a couple of slides' time, in about half an hour, I'm going to be having particular umbrage with this idea, and I'm going to be critiquing and fighting against it. But I just want to set it up now so that when I start talking about it later, you know sort of the context and where I'm coming from with it. But that's basically satire in a nutshell, or at very least, it's the definition of satire that we're going to use for the rest of the text and the presentation. So when it comes to reading satires, if they're about taking recognizable forms and changing them in various ways, that gives us a basic methodology of how to read satires and try to understand them. Is basically sort of, you take a satirical text and you figure out what this text is similar to, what it's replicating, what it's trying to draw on. And then once you've done that, step 2, you figure out how it changes that thing. And then step 3, you figure out what that change means, particularly to, you know, sort of the text's presumed audience. So ergo, if we want to read Rick and Morty as a satirical text, that's what we have to do. And the good news about it is if that you want to look at Rick and Morty and figure out what it's like, that's relatively easy because Rick and Morty really does wear its influences on its sleeve. It's a sci-fi show about an old scientist and his young ward, and they go off into the universe and they go on adventures. There's a lot of texts which are like this. When I think of texts like this, the first things that come to mind is usually Doctor Who, because I'm a nerd. But you've got basically the same archetype. You've got the, the unfathomably old genius scientist who has, bits of tech, has a sonic screwdriver, he has the TARDIS. They have the sonic screwdriver, they have the TARDIS. And they go out into time and space, and they usually bring their young companion with them. And they show them the universe and they go on adventures and, they learn about all sorts of things, and stuff like that. But you also sort of have this archetype appear in such things as Star Wars, particularly the first one. You've got Luke Skywalker, who is, this young ward, who, comes into contact with this old man who has all of this knowledge about the universe and, how it all works. And the old man introduces the young one to the universe and shows them what it is and what it's all about. And you've also got stuff like Back to the Future. Marty McFly goes into the past and so has to find, an old scientist in order to, who has all of this knowledge about science and time travel and, find out how he can get back to the future. As I say, this is a very standard trope. This is a very standard setup, particularly within the sci-fi genre. To the point that, one of the major texts that identified it, was written in the 1940s, is Joseph Campbell talks an awful lot about this archetype in his monomyth, which he calls the hero's journey. And Joseph Campbell argues that, this is one of the, underpinning stories that all mythologies are based on. That needs a massive citation needed, sign sticking to it. But nevertheless, the hero's journey has become very popular amongst screenwriter circles as a way of structuring stories. And Dan Harmon, who's the main writer of Rick and Morty, bases all of his story structures very closely to a version of the hero journey that he's developed called the story circle. In this, Campbell talks about, he identifies this relationship as that of the hero and his aid. is in which case the hero is the young character who's taken his first steps into the world. The aid is the elderly character who has all of the knowledge required for the hero to sort of understand the world and come to terms with it. To use Campbell's own words, the aid is a protective figure who is often a little old crone or an old man, and who provides the adventurer with the knowledge required to fulfill their quest. So that's what Rick and Morty is drawing on, which means step two, we need to figure out how it differs. Now, the big thing about the hero and his aid, which is identified by Joseph Campbell, which is that their relationship is meant to be a nurturing one, is the aid represents the benign, I've got our pictures covering that word and I can't remember what it is, so I'm going to skip it. The benign, reassuring, whatever it is, power of destiny. And is a reassurance to both the hero and the audience. Is so sort of when Campbell talks about the aid and the hero and their relationship, he makes a big focus about how it's usually a multi-generational relationship. It's about a young person coming together with an old person and learning about the history and where they fit in with the world so that they can reconfigure all of this old information to a new form in order to, you know, sort of be able to affect the world as it exists around them. So it's, you know, sort of, he argues that all these stories are about old and new coming together to create new progressive forms. And as I say, it's all about reassurance, it's all about nurturing, it's all about people working together for the greater good. This is not Rick and Morty's relationship. Is, as previously discussed, Rick and Morty's relationship is incredibly one-sided. I'm not going to really mince my words. It's straightforwardly abusive. Rick is straightforwardly an abuser. And the Smith family and Morty are straightforwardly the victims of it. At the very least, under my reading, it's incredibly, as I say, sort of Rick genuinely believes that he is the greatest person in the world, the most important person because he knows the most about the universe. He uses this as his justification for why he's able to just get away with doing whatever he wants. So a lot of the stories are Rick going on errands and dragging Morty along with him. In particular, we're going to focus on the first episode, which is, you know, sort of the pilot episode, which tries to define the series. Sort of in it, the plot line is that Rick needs to go into an alien world in order to get some megaseeds for an experiment. And he drags Morty out of school along with him and takes him through this alien landscape that Morty is quite obviously not very comfortable with. And they get the megaseeds, but there's something wrong with Rick's teleportation system. So they've got to get the megaseeds through space customs, which is like airplane customs, but in space. But megaseeds are a banned substance. So Rick convinces Morty to stick the megaseeds up his butt. And to get them through space customs but things go wrong and there's all sorts of sci-fi shenanigans and explosions. But eventually they get back home, but it's taken too long. And it turns out that if you keep megaseeds in your butt for too long, they start dissolving and assimilating in your system and they rob you of your motor functions. And that's what happens to Morty. And so what we're going to do is we're going to quickly watch the final scene of this episode, which is Morty dealing with the effects of the megaseeds while Rick starts talking about how they're going to have to get more megaseeds because they've been dissolved in Morty now and he still wants to do his experiment.
Times, rickandmorty.com.
That is not a nurturing relationship, in case anyone is wondering. You get this power dynamic that's involved with it. You've got the way that Morty, you've got it in the script, the way that, you know, sort of Rick is just straightforwardly has put Morty in this situation that Morty's suffering, that Rick is ignoring it. But you've got that reflected in the mise-en-scène and the composition. You've got the way that Morty is writhing around on the floor. You've got the way that Rick is stood over him, sort of becoming a leering figure. And the focus is very much on Morty and very much on Morty's discomfort. You've got the close-ups of Morty is, you know, sort of on the floor, which, you know, sort of focus and really stress the idea that he's not particularly liking this. But then what you also have is you get the shots from Morty's perspective that are looking up at Rick, where he becomes this dominating, leering figure. and you've got the light flashing behind him so that his face gets cast into shadow and his eyes have gone wild and his spit is, sort of flying out. Sort of the episode is, the scene is constructed in order to highlight Rick's, just sort of the unpleasantness of Rick, sort of through and through, and sort of the sympathy that, sort of with us presumably meant to be sort of feeling for Morty. Is, sort of, and it's representative of a relationship which, as I say, is abusive, is one-sided, is sort of purely about the needs of this one person, and is purely about their selfish needs, instead of being about this generational sort of more collectivist sort of view. Is yes, and that sort of, as I say, so that's step two. We've identified what's different. And there's also another difference which sort of I can't figure out. There we are, and I did it. Got to the next slide. And then sort of, and this ties into another difference that Rick and Morty has against the text that it's inspired from, is because sort of, whereas when you get Doctor Who and you get Star Wars, and sort of there's nasty things sort of around, these types of environments are also usually treated as centers of wonder. Sort of, they're treated as sort of places for exploration and for self-discovery. Particularly sort of if you take the Joseph Campbell sort of methodology to heart. Again, that is not the multiverse of Rick and Morty. Sort of the horror on display in Rick and Morty's relationship sort of makes a lot more internal sense once you start considering just how horrific the multiverse that Rick and Morty exists in is. For example, sort of, if you look at the image at the bottom left, sort of the screen, we've got like sort of one of the, what I use is sort of like one of the standard sort of landscapes that Rick and Morty sort of walk through. And the first thing that you'll notice is that it's incredibly unnaturally coloured. It's inhumanly coloured. Sort of, you don't get stuff like this in nature, all of these blues and oranges, sort of usually, unless something's gone incredibly wrong, sort of with whatever environment you're walking through. But the more that sort of you look at it, sort of, sort of it is very inhuman in nature, but if there is a humanity to this landscape, then it's a very deconstructed one. And it's a very sort of quite nasty in its implications, because once you look at what seem to be trees, that's when you notice sort of just how bulbous they are and how sagging is, sort of, and how fleshy they are. And then once you've sort of noticed that, and, sort of how they're drooping and the weight that they have, then you sort of look at the ground and you notice sort of all of these lines and sort of, sort of, and the way that it's got an awful lot of detail and etching sort of within it is, sort of, and then, sort of the ground stops looking like sort of ground and becomes much more fleshy, sort of the lines become wrinkles and veins. And then sort of that's when you notice these blobs that are sort of on top of the landscape, which to all intents and purposes seem to be just red blood cells. I can't come up with something that they look more like. So in terms of sort of, and sort of this is then backed up by the actual bodies that you have on screen, which is Rick and Morty, who are very much minimized in the screen. They're very small in the screen, with all of the environment sort of existing around them and dominating them. And this comes through in the massive planets that exist in the sky and just the pure number of them. And you've got the city sort of in the background and how expansive the world is, sort of, this ends up defining sort of these landscapes as these big sort of places that are defined by the ways that they sort of diminutize human bodies. Sort of, these are places where human bodies get made lesser. Sort of, either they get shrunk by the world around them and sort of the vast scale of it all, or they get decontextualized, they get torn up, they get used by these universes. And so sort of there seems to be an inherent violence, there's an inherent threat in this landscape, that then gets rendered quite existentially in a lot of the dialogue when you have Rick walking about, so we're talking about how meaningless and cruel the universe is, sort of, we can see that in the way that these worlds are created and in the amount of detail put into them. And this is also backed up by an awful lot of the scenes that we see in the multiverse. There's an awful lot of episodes which are based around the concept of interdimensional cable, which is basically these episodes Rick and Morty watch random shows which are presumably being broadcast at various different dimensions within the multiverse. And so sort of, and a recurring facet in all of these is just the extreme body horror on display in these sketches. It's very frequent that people just get beat up and tore apart and all sorts of things in them. For example, in the middle, we have the infamous Ants in My Eyes Johnson from Ants in My Eyes Johnson Electronics, who is a guy who, he's just a normal guy. He runs an electronics store. He just has ants crawling around his eyes. And also he can't feel pain, which is a significant issue at the end of the advert for his store, where he sets himself on fire. And to the right, you've got Philip Jacobs, who hosts the Personal Space Show, which is all about how important keeping your personal space is. And Philip Jacobs doesn't want anyone in his personal space. In fact, he cares about his personal space so much, he doesn't want his skin in his personal space. So the end of the sketch is him ripping his skin off. And times that by about 20 sketches over the course, each over the course of like 2 episodes. And it builds into this idea of the multiverse as, again, this place defined by body horror, by violence, which is subjected upon people. And the idea that this universe is just aggressively against human forms he will happily just throw ants in your eyes, but then expect you to carry on working at your job at a cheap electronics store. And, when Philip Jacobs tears off his skin, he looks woozy, but he finishes the show. And then it reveals that his show is broadcast on their version of BBC Two just before Downton Abbey. But once you get this, what happens in aggregate is that this violence just becomes a fundamental part of the universe. And so Rick and Morty's relationship doesn't just become a nasty relationship in an otherwise sane world. It becomes a traditional relationship that we note, that we recognize, but it's a violent, nasty one in a violent, nasty world. It's a relationship which has been reconfigured to see what this type of relationship would be like in a universe like this. And so the question is, so that's the difference. But the question is step number 3. What does this difference actually mean? Well, an awful lot of the scholarship that surrounds Rick and Morty at the moment is actually based around exploring Rick and Morty as a response to capitalism, particularly late capitalism, and particularly from a millennial perspective. Kay Coulter has an essay called Rick, Morty and Absurdism, the Millennial Allure of Dark Horror. And the way that she starts is that she notes that that Rick and Morty is, at very least when she was writing it, was like the #1 watched show by millennials. Or at very least very high up there, people are, our age, if you're millennial, really like Rick and Morty. But her essay is an attempt to figure out why it gets such a good reaction, why people seem to be relating to it so much. And her argument is that it's because it reflects the ways that millennials relate to the structures around them and the capitalist structures around them. Is particularly over the past decade, our economic systems have been defined by a move away from traditional ways of working, so like the traditional 9-to-5 job, towards much more precarious employment, and towards things like 0-hour contracts, towards freelance contracts, towards the breaking of like the 9-to-5 Monday to Friday dichotomy that used to exist. And the reason why this is happening is basically because it's cheaper. If you can pick and choose when people work, you don't have to, you can pick and choose when you pay them instead of paying them just a flat rate for turning up. But the thing about this is that the traditional view of the workplace is that it provided people with a sense of security. If you would get a 9-to-5 job and you would pick your industry and you would stick with it, and you might get promoted, but ultimately you stayed where you were. So if you were a postman, you were a postman. If you were a doctor, you were a doctor. If you worked in ceramics, you were a ceramicist. That gave you a certain amount of stability. So it meant that you could do stuff like buy a mortgage. It meant that you could do stuff like, buy a car. You could have your holiday once a year. There was a basic sense of stability. But the thing that has been noted about this movement towards more precarious forms of employment is that sense of stability has been very much dismantled over the course of the past couple of decades, particularly post the 2000s and particularly post the financial crash, which destabilized people's view of capitalism in an awful lot of ways. And the thing about it is the movement towards 0-hour contracts, these types of things are seen as much more exploitative, because the thing about them is that you don't actually get guaranteed certain types of hours. And so there's a sense, if you don't quite ever know how much money you're getting, and so it's much more difficult to plan for the future. And particularly if you consider that millennials are the most likely demographic to be on 0-hour contracts, to be in these types of industries that run on them. And so this movement in labour forces is happening around the same time that you have great advances in technology, which have resulted in the fragmentation of audiences and in the fragmentation of, societies. Things have become an awful lot more niche, at the moment. What we're getting is a moment in which an awful lot of grand narratives have been, destabilized. And so structures that we used to trust, the housing market, the financial market, employment, capitalism, they've all been disrupted. And they've all become, they've all been disrupted, and they've all become more difficult to live with. They've all become, it's more difficult to make a standard wage. It's more difficult to, do these types of things. And so there's become a societal narrative, which is one of devolvement, which is that society over the past couple of decades has progressively got worse. And once you've situated that as a commonplace view of society, particularly amongst millennials, all of a sudden the idea of Rick and Morty being a show which takes the standard types of worlds that we see in, traditionally utopian sci-fi texts, and that we see in these types of things, and making them grimmer and making them more violent and making them more exploitative. That follows and speaks to a lot about the way that people see the types of structures that we live in nowadays. And, particularly with the way that Rick seems to be reflective of the universe at large. What you end up with is this concept of Rick as almost representing the worst aspects of modern society, but made manifest, that his petty abuses are almost being used as metaphoric for the abuses of capitalism overall. Yes, and El Miranda makes a similar argument in her essay, The Self is Dead, Alienation and Nihilism in Rick and Morty. She takes it the next step, where basically she identifies that, millennials have this much more questionable relationship with the structures of capitalism. And that what happens when you've got this less trust is that you feel more alienated from the system, which leads to alienation, which leads to nihilism, which then leads to the nihilistic sense of humor of Rick and Morty. And it's much more, ironic to the, our current embrace of, ironic, dark, I suppose you could call it dank humor, if you wanted to situate it like that. Yeah. And, hello there. It looks like it's going to play. There we are. And if you're wondering whether I'm this linking of the abuses of Rick to the structures of capitalism is being a little bit over-egged. You get this thing, which I really like. It's one of my favourite scenes of the show. Just a little bit of evidence, just in case you're. So yes, please note the basic setup of this scene as well. That it's it's nominally pro-capitalist sequence, but that refers to such things as the bleeding jaws of capitalism. And, through the yes, daddy, please thing, relates consumption under capitalism to almost being like a sadomasochistic relationship. But notice visually the setup that we've got here. We've got Morty, who's been pushed onto the floor by Rick's actions. We've got Rick leering over him. We've got what seems to be a deliberate callback to the first episode, which was all about defining Rick and Morty's relationship as being one-sided, exploitative, and abusive. So we do have this conflation here that's within the text and is being drawn out by these critical texts. Is the idea that if Rick and Morty changes the aspects of sci-fi tropes in order to darkify them and make them meaner and nastier in a world which is commonly perceived as being mean and nasty. sort of particularly sort of in our age of late capitalism. That is the satiric intent. That's Rick and Morty as a satire. Now I have to figure out the screen. There we are. I did it. So the show's observed the capitalist existence is a bit rubbish, and it uses Rick's petty abuses as metaphoric for the social abuses of capitalism. Given this, though, we have to now start returning to our original question, because, you know, sort of the thing about Rick is that if he's being used as representative of the worst aspects of modern society, which I would argue sort of he is, you know, sort of he's being used to, you know, sort of represent this type of system, why can't the show actually disavow him? You know, sort of, why is he a main character? You know, why is he an anti-hero as opposed to a villain? Is, you know, sort of, why is so much of the show dedicated to following him? You know, so why are there so many episodes which are about, you know, sort of exploring him as a character, about looking into where his, you know, sort of stuff comes from? Is, you know, sort of, and why are there so many episodes that, you know, sort of our adventures with him that assume that you care about him and empathize with him? You know, sort of, you know, if this is a satirical text and he's representative of everything that's wrong with the world, you know, sort of, why isn't it, you know, taking the opportunity to, you know, sort of really go for it? You know, sort of, we go back to our original question, sort of, is the show anti-Rick or is it pro-Rick? You know, sort of, why does there seem to be this, you know, sort of, this sticky situation sort of with him? Well, once we're asking that question and trying to sort of come up with answers, I suppose the first thing that we need to sort of consider is that there are multiple types of satire. Is because when I previously talked about this idea that sort of satire is usually read as being inherently negative, it is an inherently negative form, is only used for dismissal. You know, sort of, you present something, you show why it's rubbish, and then you hope that people stop thinking about it and care about it less. You can get away with that if you're like doing a satirical comedy sketch on the internet. You can get away with that if you're doing like a one-panel cartoon in a newspaper, because the nature of these texts is that they're one and done. Is, you know, sort of, here's the thing, isn't it rubbish? Okay, we're finished, move on. But Rick and Morty is, you know, sort of, it's an ongoing narrative. In particular, it's you know, sort of, the thing we've always got to remember about Rick and Morty is that it's narrative satire. In particular, it's an ongoing TV show. And TV is, you know, sort of based around this idea of being ever continuous. Is, you know, sort of, you're always meant to want to watch the next episode. You're always meant to want the next series. And so when people put together sort of television programs, the aim is always to have a setup which can be replicated and can be sort of constantly explored over and over again. So the nature of its medium means that Rick and Morty is satirical, but it's also very narrative focused. And the thing about narratives is that they rely upon empathy. Is, you know, sort of, narrative enables exploration of characters' minds and their interactions in the social world, and in turn invite readers to think and feel for themselves. Is, you know, sort of, we're meant to be, you know, sort of, when someone gets put on screen, sort of, the implication there is that they're in some way important. Is, you know, sort of, because when we watch something, we always have this awareness of the narrator, you know, sort of, that these are stories which are being told to us. And ergo, if something appears on the screen, presumably it can be assumed to be important. So if you put someone on screen and show their actions, the assumption is that they're meant to be seen as in some way interesting, and we're meant to want to follow them. And so interest is piqued. We're invited to try to empathize with them. We're invited to try to relate to them and figure out what they're doing and who they are, and what this means in the course of the show overall. So, as I say, sort of narrative, you know, so in terms of this, so narrative satire thus must also sort of rely upon this type of empathy, this type of creating relationships with the people. Is because, you know, ultimately, you know, sort of, if people don't relate to a text, they just stop watching it. Is, you know, sort of, if we sat there and, you know, sort of, if the show is obviously, you know, sort of using Rick as representative of the social malaise, but sort of, because they want to talk about this social malaise, and because Rick is the main way of embodying it, sort of, within the text, he has to become a main character. But because it's a narrative satire, because it's an ongoing TV show, you know, sort of the fact that he's a main character is going to automatically sort of require the audience to have a certain amount of investment in him. Because if he is just a straight, reprehensible nightmare of a human being, and if everything he does is completely and totally like absolutely sickening to the core, and there's no like interest there or sort of guiding lights whatsoever, we're just not going to watch the show, we're not going to care. And so, you know, sort of Rick can be representative of anything he wants, you know, sort of, but if he doesn't have this, you know, sort of at least an attempt to explore him and to create some form of way into his mind space and of creating a way of being able to empathize with him, we're never going to look at him close enough in order to realize what he represents and the types of malaises that come with him and how he reflects the world around him. You know, sort of, if we're to spend enough time with Rick to understand him as a reaction to the world around him, he needs to be made an engaging character who's going to invite empathy. As such, narrative satire doesn't really use this type of dismissive approach all that often. Instead, it seems to use a two-pronged approach in which it will identify illogical and unpleasant behavior. It will identify ideas that it doesn't like, is sort of the way that we usually conceptualize satire as doing. But instead of sort of dismissing it sort of out of hand immediately, it will look to find ways of exploring it. You know, sort of, it will try to find ways of getting us to empathize with people. It works under the assumption that the vast majority of the audience is going to recognize Rick as being a pretty miserable human being, and that we're going to recognize his actions as unacceptable. And working under that assumption, it then tries to get us to empathize with it in order to understand those actions. And that isn't a dismissal per se, but it's more sort of like a complication. It's trying to get us to negotiate how we relate to Rick. Particularly because you've also got to remember that in Rick and Morty, Rick isn't the only character. We also, you know, sort of in the scene that we watched in the pilot episode, Morty is also there, and we're being invited to relate and to empathize with Morty's situation, sort of more so than we are Rick's. And the family all bring their own dynamics to things. And so by splitting these people up and putting them in different situations, we're being asked to, you know, sort of think about how we relate to these people, and thus how we relate to, you know, sort of what they represent and the malaise that they represent. The thing about moving this type of thing to sort of working on empathy and sympathy, though, is that, you know, sort of each audience member is ultimately going to come to a work of satire with their own baggage. And they're all going to relate to these, to these satires differently and make their own conclusions about it. You know, sort of if you do search Rick and Morty on, you know, sort of on the internet, it's not going to take you very long to find someone who thinks that Rick is just, you know, an absolutely repellent, reprehensible character. But, you know, but they think that, you know, that's what makes the show interesting, and that, you know, sort of Rick represents all of these things, and it's what makes the show good and interesting. But if you keep looking around, it's also not going to take very long for you to find someone who finds Rick to be absolutely reprehensible and a reprehensible character. And that's why they hate the show. And that's why they think it shouldn't be made, because why the bloody hell would you want to be watching this guy? You know, sort of, and, you know, sort of all of the attempts to make him more complicated, well, you know, sort of that's just making that's just painting, you know, lipstick on a pig. Is, you know, sort of, why would you want this? Is, you know, sort of, and you were not going to also find it very difficult to find someone who relates to Rick and thinks that Rick is brilliant, because, you know, Rick is incredibly clever and he's incredibly powerful, and there's plenty of people who want to be that by hook or by crook. Is, you know, so sort of, I would say, and that's the reason why it's so difficult, you know, sort of, and why there's so little consensus about, you know, is Rick and Morty pro-Rick or is it anti-Rick? Is because ultimately, sort of, the answer to that question is in the eye of the beholder. It's moved to the text. It's, you know, sort of the narrative text itself can't really resolve that. It gets moved to the audience. So, you know, in short, you know, sort of, is Rick and Morty pro-Rick or anti-Rick? Rick and Morty is as anti or pro-Rick as you want it to be. And, you know, sort of, there's as many answers to that question as there are people who watch Rick and Morty. yes, it raises these questions about power and about abuse and about, about how we relate to the world about them and about where this world is going. But, it leads us to make our own conclusions, based on the raw material it provides. So where does that lead us in terms of, thinking about satire and conceptualizing satire? Particularly, while trying to read it and while trying to make it and while trying to make and read political messages into these works. Well, the first thing that we always need to think is, different forms of satire can be used to achieve different effects. The reason why Rick and Morty is based around exploring Rick as a character as opposed to disavowing him is because it's an ongoing television program, which, via the narrative structures around it, you need Rick as a main character. And that's just how you write, that's how these types of texts usually have to work. So, if you want to do this type of dismissive stuff, then you want the short, sharp shock of, much more restricted forms. If you've got something that you want to explore more, then you use the TV program. And we've got to, think about that while we're making satires. We've got to consider the mediums that we're making satires in and what those mediums can do and what we think those mediums can do. And also, when reading satires, we need to use this in order to, shape our perceptions of it. What do we expect of these shows? Do we really expect something like Rick and Morty to be able to, just go Rick's a prick every day for, episode after episode? And related to this, I think we should also conceptualize, satire as something which isn't inherently negative. Because, the way that it works is that ultimately, particularly narrative satire, in my view, works mostly through creating sympathy and creating empathy at the same time as, creating characters who are repellent. It's about having that balance. Because it's being used to create sympathy and empathy, there's really no particular reason why, these forms of satire have to be, purely negative. They're not about dismissal. They're about raising questions, about trying to get people to reconsider how they relate to things. And I do actually think that's one of the big issues with satire at the moment is the way, particularly with TV satire, particularly with the type of satire that you get in shows like Rick and Morty, but also things like Archer or It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, is the way that these shows are usually used to explore behavior that presumably the authors find to be reprehensible and find to be problematic. Which then raises all of these sticky questions. Are they meaning to do that? Is it pro or anti this material? Whereas if you was to make satires which were about taking things that, the artist actually likes, but, looking at the idiosyncrasies and, the bits that maybe don't make sense of something that the show is still basically sympathetic to, then, what you do end up doing is you do end up maybe inviting people to engage with it more and inviting people to, it does seem, it could almost be used as a quite good recruiting tool. As much as it can be used as a way of trying to dissuade people from thinking and engaging with things in certain ways. And as I say, it rarely dismisses things as much as it, more tries to complicate our relationship with them. As I say, particularly if we're thinking about narrative satires. And the result of this does mean that there will be as many readings of a satire as there are audience members. But the thing that we can do, and the thing that we can use satire to do, is to dictate, what they're reading. We can't dictate the answers, but we can raise the questions, and we can, invite people to engage with stuff that we think needs engaging with. Even if you do your works, even if you make a satire or you have a satire which works on a polemical level, where, it literally grabs the camera and starts, shouting its message down the lens, you still open yourself up to an audience member just going, well, I disagree with you. No matter how stringent you make the message, you're still going to have that sense of negotiation that comes through filtering it through media forms and presenting it to an audience. But, you know, sort of, even if they are negating it, you're still raising the question, you're still, you know, sort of inspiring, sort of, you know, encouraging engagement. And, you know, sort of fingers crossed, you might be able to get people a bit more sort of, you know, sort of on your side. So yes, so that's basically my conclusion and that's basically my talk yes, that's maybe what satire, maybe that's what Rick and Morty has to teach us sort of about the ways that we can think about satire. Maybe that's what Rick and Morty is doing and fingers crossed, yeah, sort of maybe this is a springboard or maybe I'm speaking twaddle, who can say, but yes, thank you for listening to the talk.